Does the Israeli military target civilians? Is the immigration crisis comparable to the birthrate crisis? And is the non-aggression principle sufficient to stop bad actors in public places? We tackled these questions and more on this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we go through the internet and find the cringiest or the best takes, and we talk about what we like or dislike about them. My name is Donald. I'm here with my co-host Britt. And before we get started, just a reminder to like and share and comment. Helps us out a ton. Just taking a moment to do that really goes a long way. You can also follow us on Good Take, Bad Take Pod on Instagram and Good Bad Take Pod on Twitter and YouTube. Without further ado, the first take. Now, I have not shown this one to Britt because I wanted him to see if he figures out the interesting thing from this post. So this is a post that was made by someone who I really like and respect, so I'm not outing them. There was a conference that they went to, and they shared an image of a panel from this conference, and they write, an incredible discussion about anti-Semitism and October 7th. The panel included an amazing young woman from Mercer Island who decided to join the IDF when she was 18 and served in combat. She told a story about a friend who was court-martialed because he refused to drop a bomb on a Hamas building because they put a family and children on the roof. Even Hamas knows Israeli soldiers are moral and uses its own lack of morality as a weapon. Okay, what do you make of this take?
Well, there's a few things in it which is kind of interesting. So the first part, when we were at NU, did you ever go to the Eagles for Israel meetings?
I knew of it, but I never went.
Okay, yeah, I went. My roommate, or long story, but a guy that I was supposed to room with, but ended up not rooming with, but we became friends. Kind of headed this thing called Eagles for Israel, and it was part of this program that I think Israel or some lobby from Israel put together, where they would have Israeli soldiers come in and do talks in classrooms at college universities, and the goal was to obviously. It's a propaganda talk where it's basically like saying, oh, the Israeli soldiers are perfect and awesome, and we always do a good job and do all these different types of things, and the other side is really bad, and the IDF is blameless. So what was always interesting to me, is these Israeli soldiers talk about this, but it's like, oh yeah, it's in Israel, it is forced conscription. Like they have the largest, or they don't have the largest, but they have one of the largest armies in the whole world because they can technically count every single civilian as one of their folks. And so this gal, she's 18 and she served in combat. And it's like, okay, so you basically have a proverbial child. I mean, she's just barely out of being a child. And they're being put in harm's way to, go fight Hamas and all these different things. So that's kind of funny to me.
She is from Mercer Island, to be fair, though. So I was going to say, yeah. So she's from Washington, who signed up to go fight over there. But almost speaks to the fact that it's crazy to get to that point, right?
Yeah.
To be from the U.S., probably had a couple of Eagles for Israel type groups talking to her to go over to Israel. Maybe she has descent or something.
But, I thought she'd moved to Mercer Island after she. I don't know.
Israel. That's not clear to me. But I think she was originally from Mercer Island. If I understand correctly.
Okay, so she's not even an Israeli. She's,
as far as I'm aware,
a Washingtonian.
Maybe has some descent or something like that. But yeah.
Yeah. So you've got that, and then so that's like okay. That's an issue. Obviously, you're conscripting children or basically children. I know we consider 18 to be an adult, but anyone who's 25 and looked at an 18-year-old, you're like, what? This is not an adult. This is a kid. And I don't think it's good for kids to be in war, especially wars that can be prevented and when people can live at peace. But this guy got court-martialed that she's telling a story about because he refused to drop a bomb in a good way, on a family, on a roof. So they're talking about Hamas knows that Israel soldiers are moral and they use their own lack of morality as a weapon, or Hamas using its own lack of morality as a weapon. It's yeah, and they penalized the Israeli soldier.
Exactly.
They penalized him for doing the moral action. So which side considers lack of morality its weapon, right? Because it's if you were in a fighting scenario and you had a gun and you had it pointed at the enemy and your sergeant told you to shoot it and you didn't shoot it, you didn't use your weapon, then you would be court-martialed as disobeying orders. You're supposed to use that tool to destroy the enemy. And so when this Israeli soldier was told to use his tool to destroy the enemy, which was his lack of morality to bomb children and family, it wasn't considered like, oh yeah, you were doing the right thing. It was considered, oh, you didn't use the tool we've given you to wage warfare. And so that's kind of I'm assuming that's what you were pointing out in it, but that's like it's not even like Israel was like, oh yeah, good job. Like, we don't want to have dead children. It was like, no, bad for you. Like, you disobeyed orders, to take the Clone Wars, Star Wars Clone Wars, clones category or quote, they say good soldiers follow orders, when they're massacring the Jedi children. So this guy, the Israeli soldier is moral and good. The Israeli government is obviously not.
Exactly. This posits this reframes the debate as being every single Israeli soldier is immoral. And that's never been the argument, right? It's never been the argument that every single action Israel has taken is wrong. That's the easy way to set up a straw man. Because for instance, if I were to say the United States should not intervene overseas in, let's say, let's not go bomb Iran, it's then the easy position to say, oh, well, Donald's position is that there is no circumstance in which the U.S. should ever act in any capacity whatsoever. And that's not my position. I think that there technically can be some foreign interventions that are justified, but it has to be responsive, it has to be limited, it has to be provoked by someone else, it has to be directly in self-interest, whatever. But when you change the framing of the debate, and instead of arguing the actual points, you can reframe it really easily. So here's what's going on there. He's saying, look, this guy was court-martialed. He took a heroic stand and did a moral thing in the face of adversity. Hamas would never do that. And it's like, yeah, I'm not saying Hamas would do that. I'm not saying Hamas are the good guys. I think Hamas are evil. I think Hamas puts innocent civilians in harm's way. And so does Israel, just tacitly admitted in your story. Because the fact that he didn't bomb this building because of innocence, it's not even like it was a story of, they put soldiers on the roof and he refused to do it and took a stand. It was that he was proactively punished, and that this is the abnormal thing for a soldier to do in the Israeli army. That's crazy to admit. What you are tacitly admitting is that Israel's normal policy is to bomb the targets regardless of the innocent civilians and the innocent families there. This is something that the pro-Israel lobby will never admit they do. And I mean, that's just an absurd thing to say. They will always say, oh, Israel doesn't bomb cities of civilians. Israel doesn't target civilians. This story literally just admits that for one target that was refused to be bombed, an individual got court-martialed over it because he wouldn't kill an innocent family. So again, kudos to this soldier. Kudos to the military individuals who do stand up from right and wrong in this case. But this is just another condemnation of the Israeli government and a tacit admission that it is official Israeli policy to kill civilians. Now, again, that's not actually that surprising, and there will always be goalpost shifting, because now, once this has been admitted, proponents will often say, well, that's just warfare. What are you going to expect to do? That's the cost of war. And that's, we'll push on. We'll keep saying. But it has always been the position of the defenders, the absolutist defenders of Israel, that they never bomb civilians and they never target civilians. And this clearly is an example of not only do they target civilians, but when there's any kind of aberration in that plan, there are severe repercussions for it.
Yeah. There's a saying in the tech industry that the point of a system is what it does. And I think I've talked about it before on the show, but essentially what it means is that, like, people could say that a system that you've built is supposed to do this, but the system acts independently of the designer's intent. And so the actual point of a system is if it produces an undesirable outcome, that's actually what it was designed to do, because it's what it does. There doesn't matter what intent you have, that's the outcome that occurs. And since October 7th, and this isn't even going back before October 7th, when there are many other Palestinians killed, but since October 7th, the system of Israel responding to the October 7th attacks has resulted in one child in Gaza being killed every 10 minutes. And so when you kind of put that in perspective, like, oh my goodness, like I think about my little daughter who's 4 months old, children between her age and younger, and, between that age and age 17, like once every 10 minutes, like that's incredible tragedy of a proportion I don't want to and never have understood, and I hope I never have to understand. And the whole goal, regardless of whatever intent we try to assign to the IDF and to Israel, the result of the system that they've set up is that, and yes, Hamas is to blame as well for this. But if you continue go back, you could kind of see these different types of actions that Israel's taken over the years has inevitably reached to this point. So it's like maybe more of the same is not called for. Maybe more of the same is not the best way for us to get out of this cycle of violence. Maybe there needs to be a different approach to it. Because there's no justification anywhere ever for any government to have the amount of death of innocents that is currently occurring right now in the Gaza Strip.
And if one Palestinian child every 10 minutes is dying, I do think you need to at least hold that and to say every day, an American is on TikTok. They're getting 17% more anti-Semitic though. Britt, according to Nikki Haley. So
I don't know. How do you quantify that? Is that absolute or relative percentage?
Okay, all right. We'll move on to the next take here. So this is a quote retweet of Jeremy Kauffman, who is I don't know. Is he still officially in the Libertarian?
I have no idea.
I don't know.
And he was part of the Free State Project.
Yeah. So, somewhere in there. Anyway, so he tweets, a Libertarian Party candidate should campaign on the redistribution of Taylor Swift. There's no moral principle under which income redistribution is permissible, but sex redistribution is not. And there's a quote retweet which reads, bodily and property autonomy are not the same. This is disgusting. All right. Critiquing the top take, yes. I assume.
Yes.
What do you make of it?
Yeah, so first of all, Jeremy Kauffman, really good on principles. Every now and then, the tone that he uses and the examples he uses are a little bit too much for me. And this is right on the border of that, but it does make a really interesting point, and it does draw out interesting responses that, you can kind of take on. And this is one of them that I found. So this person says that bodily and property autonomy are not the same, but if you think about what it takes to obtain or maintain property, it requires something from your body, right? And I'm not saying that in a derogatory term. I'm saying that hey, if I want to maintain a house, or if I want to obtain a house, I need to assemble wood. I need to put drywall on. I need to run cable. I need to use my body to do that. Maybe I don't even construct it, but maybe I work somewhere with my body to make money so that I can pay someone else that knows how to do it. Same wise, if you just inherited property or something like that, you still have to maintain it through income, through using your body for work to do that. And so any claim to property and saying that I should be able to redistribute property, there is bodily autonomy attached to that property. It requires your body to maintain or to obtain that property. And so anytime someone advocates for that, they are really saying hey, some of your body's time that was spent to obtain this or maintain this, we're going to redistribute that. It might be a few steps removed, but it's still the same principle.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think that Jeremy's take is actually right here, but it's one of those things where I think that the top take is maybe correct for the wrong reasons, though, because the autonomy of them isn't the same, or
sure,
to treat them is not exchangeable, right? Because it would not be from this person's view, I would believe, but you and I would hold that your body is distinct from property, right? Yes. There's no monetary amount at which you can value a human, because we are indescribable beyond value in these kinds of terms. But when it talks about the principle of, for instance, the way that left-wing people who will say things like sex work is work, and under that principle, there's actually no distinction, right? Because if you are saying that sex is a commodification of something, then under redistribution of wealth and redistribution of sex in this way actually are not distinguishable, right? But the framework under which you and I operate would show that no, actually, sex is a sacred thing that should not be commercialized, and therefore they're not the same. But if your framework is that sex work is real work, then there is no distinction. So Jeremy Kauffman's split is there's no moral principle under which income redistribution is permissible, but sex redistribution is not, is actually correct. His bottom thing there is is correct, because you cannot hold both of those views. And you and I would hold that neither of those views are correct. So the top issue, unless they're coming from a sort of, spiritual angle, I actually don't know how you make that argument. So it entirely depends on the framework, because Jeremy's both right and wrong, and the top take is both right and wrong.
Sure. And I think that, like, it's kind of the argument that people make about, like, healthcare, right? Where they're like, hey, healthcare is a right. Well, for it to be a right, that requires someone to potentially work for free or for less than what their normal wage would be, and against their will, potentially. So if I have a right to, get a physical checkup every month, and I don't have the money to pay for it, but I have a right to take it, that means someone else either had to pay for that physical checkup, or the doctor that performs that physical is forced to do that. And like you're saying, like, it gets messy when you're talking about sex, something that we hold sacred, because it's almost different in kind, in terms of, like, I'm not saying this in a derogatory or bad way, but, like, in terms of, like, if it's a property or product or whatever, it's different in kind, it's sacred. But if you could change it, right? Like, everyone is owed, a membership to a gym, or something like that. Or everyone is owed, I don't know, any sort of, like, product that is required, that is not sacred or spiritual in that way, you could replace it for, and it would be a less triggering analogy. But I think that's the point of Jeremy's posting, is to be a bit triggering, to draw these things out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the point of what he's saying is to make the point.
Yeah.
And even just based on the fact that it is limited in Twitter space and things like that, you're going to have these constraints. So you and I have maybe had our issues with his messaging in general. And to me, this kind of take is like, what he's highlighting at the correct targeted audience actually rings very true.
Yes.
But I think the broad sharing leaves a lot of undesirable impressions that I think you could weigh the merits of whether or not they're harmful or hurtful, but or beneficial. I tend to think that most people the takeaway there is not going to be wow, I see the logical consistency. If you think one, then you have to think the other. I don't think people walk away from that, but he is right. If you view things in a materialistic sense and there is no higher order, then yes, there is no principle under which you can separate arbitrarily an income redistribution, that is, what you choose to do with your body, with sex redistribution, which would be what you choose to do with your body. Because both, if they are not voluntary in nature, or if it's a violation. We see it in the case of sex often. Hopefully most people should understand that. But for some reason, we don't see it in the violation of income. And I would argue that that's probably because the sacredness of our bodies and sex as an act is somewhat instilled in our culture and should be.
Yes.
But if you are rejecting that sacred nature, then there's actually no principle under which you can consistently say that income redistribution is morally acceptable in the same way that sexual reproduction is morally acceptable.
Yes.
Okay, our next take here is a meme that is a four quadrants. You have sort of a Wojak saying, if you want more immigrants, you must house them, with a response of a female Wojak saying, if you want higher birth rates, you must house them. And then the Wojak becomes a crying, angry soy jack. So he totally gets owned, because he's saying, if you want more immigrants, you got to house them. And women are saying, well, if you want higher birth rates, then you have to house them. All right. What about this? Are you totally owned?
This is from the Project Liberal Caucus, or whatever the page is. I accidentally cut it off when I screenshot it. I don't really know what argument or point they're trying to make here in a lot of ways. Because it's like, if you want to go from the point of like are they kind of pro-life, or are they anti, or are they pro-abortion, or are they pro-immigrant, or are they anti-immigrant? And maybe we should quantify it as illegal immigrant, because that's really what's on the docket here. And I think the main difference between these things is like, and this is the example you've used before when talking about abortion. It's like, hey, if I invite someone into my home, I am required as a duty to make sure that person gets into my home and out of my home safely. Like I can't, just because I invited them in my home doesn't mean I have a right to, destroy them or something like that. Unless, of course, they start to violate whatever the mutual agreement of, like, my property, and they threaten my life or something like that is. And so this is kind of like a weird equivalency to draw, because when a woman, even in cases where it's violence, like you have an innocent life that has been put into your body, that is there, that you now have a duty to garner safe passage. You don't. I would argue you do have a duty after the kid is out for you to maintain it, but you at least have a duty to get the kid out. You can't kill the kid while it's in your womb. Same thing. If I invited immigrants into the country onto my property, let's say I had a house on the border and I shared a direct border line with Mexico, and I invited immigrants onto my property, as would be my right, I would be forced to somewhat house them, or at least make sure they can get onto my property and off of my property within the agreement without any sort of false premise or violence that occurs upon them. But we don't have a case of immigrants coming in. At least what people are talking about is not immigrants coming in invited. These are immigrants that are coming in uninvited, that are circumventing the terms of the deal, literally breaking in to property that is not owned by them, that is, quote unquote, owned by the people of America or the United States. And regardless, it's public property, has its own issues, but like that's, at least we can all agree upon that, right? Like, this is the property of the United States. There are people that have not been invited and they're coming on to this property, and so you don't actually have a duty to remove them. You actually have a duty to prevent that from occurring.
Yeah, I think the other weird idea is that like higher birth rates are somehow being ushered in by more conservative individuals. I don't get what that is, unless you're saying higher birth rates specifically from preventing abortions or something. But at that point, that's the meme is not well worded. So I don't know that I can jump to the conclusion that they're saying higher birth rates through preventing abortions so much as just higher birth rates in general. But the other thing is, you look at, and it's like higher birth rates as a principle of what you do or don't want. That's not an unrealistic thing to desire. When you just look at global birth rates, especially in the West and in the US, you want higher birth rates to sustain your economy and to sustain your nation as a whole, as well as your culture. Obviously, China's going through it. A lot of Asia is going through it with their declining birth rates. This isn't higher birth rates. Culturally speaking, can be a value, and I think it is, but it doesn't have to be. It's not like, for instance, opposing the idea of redefining marriage to include gay individuals. That to me is a cultural issue where someone like Project Liberal could look at that and think there's only a conservative perspective versus a liberal perspective here. When it comes to birth rates, that's also just an economic one. So I don't really get the critique here.
Yeah.
And like you said, the invitation thing is huge, because again, when it comes to people saying, if you want more immigrants, you must house them, that's not really how people are framing the argument. That's a really bad sort of straw man of that argument. The claim would be more along the lines of, if you don't want to prevent illegal immigration from happening, and if you are welcoming in busloads and droves of immigrants into our city, and then you are asking for the resources to provide for them, you have to provide those resources. You have to house them if they need housing. You don't get to complain about it and then extort everyone else. That's kind of the root of the complaint, not just like, if you want more immigrants. The idea is like, there is a massive amount of people illegally coming into the country, and rather than restoring people's framework of private property and restoring the framework of what a border means, you are actively aiding and abetting, and then saying that the government needs to provide resources. So the claim there is just, if you're saying that these people need resources and they're not supposed to be here in the first place, then the onus is on you to provide those resources. That's the argument. No one who wants higher birth rates is saying, and we need to make sure that every family in the US is birthing at equal amounts. It's one of those cultural things where you want the persuasive argument to win the day. You want there to be a culture of pro-family and pro-birth. But no one's forcing that. When it comes to immigration, it literally is about force. That, of course, is always the competing ideas when it comes down to freedom versus tyranny or authoritarianism. Is it voluntary or is it force? And when it comes to wanting better birth rates and wanting a better culture, most of us on this side, there are some, but most of us aren't claiming we're going to make this culture better by force, because that doesn't work. But when it comes to, for instance, immigrants coming in, they are by force coming into ostensibly land that should be quote unquote privately owned. privately owned by the US government, which is somewhat of an oxymoron, but there's supposed to be some enforcement mechanism on this property. And so people are forcing their way in, and then other people within them are now trying to force others to provide their resources. All of this is about voluntarism. And so when it comes, if you want higher birth rates, you must house them. Well, guess what? Most of the people who want higher birth rates tend to have larger families, tend to adopt more, and tend to do that anyway. So your point is not the slam dunk you think it is.
I don't have any more on this one.
Okay, let's move on to the next take. This one comes from Reason Magazine. It's kind of on a similar issue, so we'll keep going with that. Reason writes an article and tweets, "Undocumented immigrants aren't the same as an invading army, but the Texas governor keeps acting like they are." And the article title is "The Twisted Logic of Greg Abbott's Border Policy." All right. What do you think?
So I was, man, I was anticipating, because Reason is a publication. It has however many staff writers it has. The person that wrote this probably has to be pretty good at writing articles and reasoning things out, and making arguments. So I was like, I'm going to read this hoping to be pleasantly surprised that maybe there's a really solid argument to be made in here, not just some dumb, like it's not an invasion because there's not tanks, involved kind of argument. But literally when you open the article, the first picture that shows up is, this is a tank from, Russia's actual invasion of Ukraine. It's like, dude, like, I already know what kind of argument you're going to make. And they did make it. That's like, well, just because people are moving to America for a better life and to make better opportunities and stuff, that is not the same as an invasion for, as it is like in Ukraine and Russia. And of course, they would be taking the specific sides in the Ukrainian and Russian conflict. So that's kind of the crux of their argument, right? That it's like, it's just different in kind. But I remember when I was touring in the band and we were down south. This is back in 2015. We were staying down on the border in Texas. We had played some shows down there. And I was talking with we were staying on this really nice, like 200-acre farm on the border. And they were talking about how, we have to remain armed in our household, because there have been times where we've been out and about, we come back and we get back to our house and there are literal like armed drug cartel members sitting in our house, helping themselves to our food and helping themselves to the TV and stuff like that. And there's been times where, like, then before they were armed, where they try and call a border patrol agent to come and help. And the border patrol agent's like, hey, I'm like 4 hours away, because there's only staff, however many personnel per how many miles there are on the border. So if that doesn't sound like kind of like a at least a violent encounter, or one that you would see, in some sort of warfare or an invasion, like, I don't know what is. And sure, if that was like a one-off instance, that might be something different. That might be just like, oh yeah, that's kind of a coincidence. But the point of the matter is that happens all the time down there. Like, they were used to that. They're like, we have to be armed because this happens all the time. And it happens at all different sorts of towns and different households and farmsteads and things like that on the border. And so it doesn't have to be tanks. It doesn't have to be organized by the Mexican government or the cartels or anything like that. If the fact of the matter is that there's a huge group of people that have less than ideal motives for coming in, and they're taking things that are not theirs, and that they are enacting violence upon the people of the state or the property that they're going on to, and it's being done at 6 million people per year, as it was in 2023. I mean, there are not many armies in the world that are bigger than 6 million people. Like, I don't think there is actually one army in the world that has 6 million members in it, maybe China. So, that's like a massive amount. I'm not saying that every single person in that 6 million is doing bad things or has undesirable motives, but you could understand the amount of burden, the amount of fear, the amount of danger, and the amount of threat and violence that occurs when this type of stuff is happening. And so if Greg Abbott has to say, like, hey, this is an invasion, and maybe it doesn't pass the mustard of like, constitutionally James Madison said this, it's like, well, in kind and in intent and in effect, it is an invasion. In all of the different reasons, like you wouldn't see much different from anything, right? Just because it doesn't have tanks doesn't mean it doesn't have the same effect in damage and maybe it's a little bit different scale, but it's still bad and it's still wrong.
Yeah, it's one of those things where really the idea of a government adjudicating things where it really falls apart, where it's like, okay, let's look at the spirit of the law. And that's such a wishy-washy thing to actually legislate or get down in the courts. And so I get that that's not really a good way to govern, but it's also one of those things where everyone looking around can see, okay, clearly the spirit of the law regarding the federal border is that this should not be happening. And clearly we can see that the Biden administration, as well as administrations prior, are not enforcing their constitutional duty or the spirit of that law. And so now Greg Abbott is essentially trying to take the spirit of the invading army doctrine to justify filling in the gaps of what the federal government won't do. All of this is all messy because of this overarching power that the federal government says it should have and says it can have. The spirit of the Constitution should be derived that the states have a lot more power than they currently do because of the federal creep that's become. Federalism is somewhat of a joke. And so it's all of these, well, they're not technically violating or they're not technically following this or blah, blah. But when you just zoom out on the big picture, it's very plain and clear to see that, one, like you said, okay, it may not be a literal invading army, but there is clearly an invading force that is destroying things and taking resources, okay? Two, it is very clear that the federal government has claimed a monopoly on this duty that it should not have. Three, it's clearly not fulfilling that duty that it has claimed. And four, even if it's not up to the snuff of the exact letter of the law, Texas is asserting its original authority to do things and responding in kind to what is, in spirit, an invasion of this kind. And again, individually, you might be able to worm your way through justifications about why this doesn't work or why that does work. And that's the problem with lawyers and the legal system and government power as a whole. But frankly, anyone with eyes I wouldn't hesitate to guess that the reason writer here probably doesn't live in a border state, because you probably wouldn't be so cavalier and talking about it like this if you actually were seeing things firsthand. The other thing about it that makes me laugh is their argument sounds an awful lot like the people who say that the internet shouldn't constitute free speech because it's not a quill and a pen. Come on. You have mass amounts of people coming in, mass amounts of them breaking laws to come in, and they're actively, not everyone, but a lot of them, a high number of them, enough to make people concerned about where they're walking, are being violent and destroying things. For all intents and purposes, that is a modern invasion. It really is. And if you don't see that, you're kind of just burying your head in the sand. I don't know.
Yeah. Like Reason has its little tagline, like free people and free markets or something like that. So apparently they still hold to some basic libertarian economic principles and about free exchange and things like that. But it's like, okay, let's even say that there was zero violence that was occurring when this group of 6 million people were coming in. Like, they're still coming in and they are using resources that were not dedicated, produced, or allocated for them. And I'm specifically talking about like the welfare state that supports it. And so, like, if you had an invading army that came in and maybe just because of the sheer force of what they are, they don't kill anyone, but they say, hey, everyone's got to start giving me X amount of dollars and X amount of resources, you would still quantify that as like hostile. Like, it's still in effect the destruction of property, the redistribution of that property to people that did not earn it and are taking it somewhat by force, but the force of being there. And so I think that Reason is no longer, or not, is not no longer, it just remains, like they say on their website, a free market and anti-redistribution and socialism, all that stuff. But it's like at best, you can describe what's going on at the border is 6 million people forcibly, by moving, deciding that you have to give them money and give them resources and give them services. It's like, even by that metric, like, it can still constitute an invasion in spirit. And yeah, like, again, there's not necessarily tanks rolling over the border, but Greg Abbott and the other states that have signed on to what his little letter about this, they all have the right to enforce their property laws and make sure that their resources are used for the people that pay for them.
Yeah, absolutely right. I don't think I have any more, so we'll go to our last take here. And this reads, so how do you stop someone from doing undesirable things on a bus, from being dangerous on a kid's playground? You can't under the NAP, which is the non-aggression principle, because the NAP is nonsense. And this, of course, is sort of a reworded take from Owen Benjamin, the once good comedian.
Yeah.
What do you take of it? What do you make of this take?
Yeah, so Owen Benjamin, he kind of used some examples that weren't very family friendly, so I kind of took them out and rephrased them a little bit. But the spirit of his take is here, and he was specifically talking about there was an instance where a woman had adult pictures generated by AI of her, and not with her consent or anything like that. And Owen Benjamin was like, "Oh yeah, like the NAP can't deal with this." Like they're going to beg for like rule and order and stuff. And someone said, hey, like you don't actually have to have that in order to have like rule and order, or you don't have to have like, an authoritarian at the top to have rule and order. Like this will be governed by people with property rights in the NAP. And this was Owen Benjamin's response, basically saying like, well, if you have a public bus, how are you going to have someone, if someone's doing something really bad and awful and degrading on a bus, like how are you going to stop them? You can't throw them off because the non-aggression principle means no aggression. And Owen Benjamin knows better. He should know better, at least based on what you've told me. Like in the circles he ran in, like the non-aggression principle doesn't mean that you can't use aggression to enforce your property rights or enforce certain rules. It says that there is a certain types of circumstances that you are allowed to use aggression under. That's mainly defense of property, defense of personnel, and defense of the innocent. And so the way that you determine whether or not, or the way that you can ethically under the NAP remove someone from a bus that's doing something that's undesirable is if you are the owner of that bus or the owner of the bus requests you to do that. If the person that's doing the undesirable thing on the bus owns the bus, then yeah, they can go do that stuff on the bus by themselves and no one is ever going to be on that bus with them. If the second they decide to use that bus to try and run someone over, then yeah, of course, you have the ability under the non-aggression principle to now enact aggression upon that person. Same thing with the kids' playground. And where Owen Benjamin's whole shtick on this breaks down is, and we were talking about this with the other deal with immigration, is that yeah, if you have public property where no one actually, it's kind of like this weird some people own it and some people don't, then it becomes really hard to enforce the NAP because it's not clear who owns this property, so therefore it's not clear who can enforce their rights on it because everyone kind of has equal claim to it. But if you have private property and it functions as private property and it's clear who that private property is, who owns it, then yeah, enforcing the NAP is easy. It's like who owns it is the person that can decide what occurs or does not occur on that property.
Yeah. The funny thing to me is that he operates as though what we're currently living is any different from this reality. Like in our good friend Larry Sharp's immortal words, the dystopia is now. I think about the individual who stopped the violent homeless man on the bus or the train or wherever that was, and maybe subway in New York, and he got arrested for it and he was punished by the court system. And so let's recognize then that let's for the sake of argument assume that this is the case in this NAP world, that you're going to have, there's no way to stop this from happening. Okay, well now not only is there no way to stop it from happening in what we have currently, we have people who are trying to stop it actively punished by the very forces of law that you would try to rein control of. I think that we have to recognize that the people who are in power right now, who set up sort of this egalitarian society, quote unquote, that ends up with people being punished for defending other people in public spaces, those people only get power through systems of force. If we have a meritocracy, which I would argue would arise in most cases from a free society under the NAP, the people who are able to create and provide and are responsible are the ones who are going to have power. Every society is going to have people who have power and people who have less power. A meritocracy puts the people, ostensibly, who are creating and who are producing and who are creating long-term stability and have long-term vision. They're the ones who are going to be in control of the resources. Those kinds of people are so much less likely to allow this kind of behavior and to create situations in where this is not enforceable. Now, you might argue, there are going to be useless people who just have inherited money rise to the top. What do you think our current systems of power is? Do you really think that Like the amount of power Hunter Biden had over things was because he was just this brilliant diplomat that went over to Ukraine and just knew a ton about oil and things like. Of course not. So we live in a society where these things are happening, people are actively getting punished, and the useless people who don't know how to actually produce long-term stability are the ones empowering. Now, of course, the ever-shifting ephemeral sort of golden snitch that they have is, well, we just need to get the right people in power. We just need to change the culture. But of course, these systems were created, I would argue, these systems were created and filled with people who kind of were that. Like, you look at the founding fathers, and I might have my disagreements with them, but if you were to put these people in power now, they would be 99.9% better than people in power. And so this is a natural result of the institutions themselves. It is a corruption that will always occur. And frankly, in order to get back to that state, you probably need somewhat of a violent revolution, which is a terrible thing to wish upon society. And so unless every 200 years you want to have violent revolution and blood in the streets and this slow, eroding of liberties and eroding into a decaying society, we probably need to start thinking outside the box here and start moving towards a system that doesn't innately cause rot and corruption and empower people who are not good or impressive people to control the lives and keep everyone down on a quote-unquote equal level, rather than letting people be free and live lives according to what they can and want to do.
What's interesting about people's critique of anarchism and libertarianism in general and the NAP is that their argument is that it needs to be perfect, that there can't be any bad scenarios that happen, that, someone doing something undesirable on a bus or being dangerous on a kid's playground, if that could ever potentially happen in the system that you've put in place, then it's not acceptable. But they won't even hold the current system to that standard. It's not like we're going backwards if that occurred. We'd just be going sideways, right? In that scenario. So like the stuff that, like you were saying, the dystopian future is now, the building in Florida that didn't get built to code and collapsed, like that was not built to code and collapsed under the current system of there being code enforcement. The only difference is that you were forced to pay for that terrible code enforcement, and you still got the bad building. And so, and then on top of that, right, like there is no mechanism for clearing bad actors out. And that's the main difference between a free society and the society that we live in right now, is that, today, if you don't like something, if you don't like how the public school is using your dollars, if you don't like how the sidewalks are made, if you don't like how the roads are maintained, it's kind of too bad. Like you got to wait a couple years and hopefully you can vote someone else out and vote someone else, or vote someone out and vote someone else in. And then hopefully the person you voted in actually takes care of the problems that you are interested in. Most of the time it doesn't get taken care of. Like that money gets allocated someplace else, and no one really likes any sort of politician, yet we keep electing them, which is really funny. In a free market, like it's all businesses, it's all private businesses. You choose where your money's allocated. Bad actors will be there because bad actors are, they're an unavoidable part of humanity. Like there are always going to be bad people, but the difference is that there's an actual way to address and eliminate bad actors while uplifting good actors in a free society. And until we have that, like you're going to have more of the same, and you're going to be poor and be paying for it as it occurs. There will be, like I was saying, there's going to be bad people on a bus. The difference is whether or not you can remove that person from the bus and whether you have to pay for them to be on it. I prefer being able to remove them.
Yeah, well, and just remember that, just electing the best people. Well, when we're electing what when you have an election that is based on a majority vote of the people participating, you're most of the time electing the person who looks like they will do the best job, the person who's the best campaigner, not necessarily the best, most impressive person for the job. If you really are thinking in idealistic terms about controlling a society and having the right people in power, democracy would not be the way to get there, because all you are doing is incentivizing the people who are best at campaigning, not the best people at controlling. Because once again, the government sucks at actually setting up pathways for itself to have success, because even the hiring mechanism of politicians is through a popular vote, not through a hiring process or vetting with actual credentials and results, merely people who can make their tenure sound impressive. So really it seems like it's kind of a doomed conceit to begin with.
Yeah.
And with that, we will finish this episode. So thank you so much for listening. Just a reminder, if you enjoyed this episode, if you would leave it a like and share it with a friend, it means a ton to us. We'll catch you on the next one.